feel safe in their jobs. They need to feel protected in their jobs. Repealing our abortion ban, expanding our Civil Rights Act, these aren't just matters of civil rights and social justice. These are fundamentally economic issues.
Joey Andrews is the Democratic state representative for Michigan's 38th district. He is also a former policy analyst for the Michigan AFL. Joey, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Great to hear a Democratic representative that clearly you understand these issues. When I talk to Democratic legislators here, they've got no clue. I talked to the chair of the state party about the coal miner strike and about a paper mill lockout, and asked him, now that you're elected state chair, what are you going to do? And he's like, I have no idea about these things. No idea at all. Do you see yourself as part of a party in Michigan that is like-minded and similarly knowledgeable about these issues, or do you find yourself kind of fighting against the current?
I think there is certainly an understanding and knowledge gap. Something that I think has happened in the Democratic Party since 2016 is that the electorate has realigned, and in that realignment, a lot of suburbs that used to be formerly, pretty conservative Republican have become pretty overwhelmingly Democratic. With that has, brought us some electoral success across the country, but those voters don't necessarily have, backgrounds with organized labor. They might or probably have a parent, that maybe was a union member or a grandparent, as like in my case, but they don't have a lot of direct experience. And I don't think there's a broad enough understanding. And I do think that it's incumbent upon those of us, kind of in the movement and in general to really do good outreach and education. Because I think in general, most Democrats, especially elected Democrats, know that, unions are important and that labor is a force for good, but I think they're fuzzy on the details. And those details are the things that let special interest groups kind of, drive a wedge in and say, oh, well, you're going too far with this one. Why do you want to do this? And they don't really know why they want to do it. And so I think there is that information gap, and we have to do what we can to close it. As in my vision, the labor movement is the way forward. I think that it's by far of all the political movements out there, the greatest force of good that's existed.
Absolutely. So, Representative, is there anything else going on in Michigan that our listeners here in Alabama should know about as something to maybe potentially replicate or even keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that we've been doing that I think have been pretty effective. One is that our governor and our legislature also has taken to messaging around even social issues as being matters of like worker and workplace safety. So we recently expanded our state's Civil Rights Act to include protection for LGBTQ people. Up until that becomes effectively law, it's been legal in Michigan for employers to fire somebody for being gay or trans. And so we rectified that. And the message that we've sent forward is that these social issues, these civil rights issues are economic and workplace issues that people, need to feel safe in their jobs. They need to feel protected in their jobs. And so, repealing our abortion ban, expanding our Civil Rights Act, these aren't just matters of civil rights and social justice. These are fundamentally economic issues. And then the second thing is that we've been, kind of taking a broadly holistic look at all of these anti-labor laws. So aside from repealing right to work and reinstating prevailing wage, we've got a bill that's been moving through to start to rectify restricted terms of bargaining for teachers. There's a pretty terrible law that we've got that doesn't require schools to compensate teachers if contract negotiations run past the deadline date, which effectively neuters teachers' ability to bargain. We've got a few other bills out there to enable project labor agreements, get rid of those local preemption laws that I mentioned earlier, and a few, I think, exciting ideas too. Like we're working on a tax credit for union dues. maybe taking a look at some just cause legislation. I've got a personal goal of trying to get some form of codetermination done in the state, but I think that's probably a long-term goal. So I think there's a lot of really cool ideas that we're working on. And, I personally want Michigan to, kind of embrace that labor history that it's had and act as an incubator for these ideas so that other states and, other groups can see what we're doing and, know that it can be done and, have a model and a template.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is super, super exciting. And it's so cool knowing that, there's somebody like you with these that's really thinking about this kind of stuff that's in the house there. Have you, are you aware of the, what they called it in the Labour Party in the UK, the right of first refusal? Are you aware of any of those proposals?
I don't think there's anything in the works yet on that. But there should be. So that's a good point. Yeah,
well, would love to see something like that go through. I know here in Alabama, we've had this issue with child labor at the Hyundai suppliers all across the state. I mean, there's been 4 that have been shown to have been utilizing child labor, and then 6 more just in the state. I don't know how there are 10 Hyundai manufacturers in the state of Alabama. It's bizarre. But, how many of these places do we need? But there are 6 more under investigation for child labor. And so one of the things that Hyundai is doing is they're going to be divesting from these suppliers. Some of them were wholly owned subsidiaries. Some of them were majority owned, and they're going to be divesting their shares from it. And so it seems obvious to me that the workers should have the first right to refuse, that somebody's going to be buying this. Somebody's going to be buying these suppliers, and it ought to be Alabama's workers, the people who made who made these factories run. They should get a shot to run it before some private equity group from New York or DC comes and buys it and cuts jobs and cuts wages and does all these things to that we see these private equity firms do all the time. Alabama workers should get a shot at running it, and the government should give them a loan. But obviously that's not going to happen. And probably what will happen is that there will be a private equity firm buy it, and it's going to get even worse. Maybe there won't be any child labor, but the working conditions are almost certain to get even worse. And it's just really sad.
They'll close some of the factories. They'll consolidate operations. That's always what happens.
Yeah.
Something kind of on the same vein is that we've been working on banning non-compete clauses. Very similar workforce issue that you see when company comes in and takes over and lays off workforce, is that these non-compete clauses prevent people from re-entering the workforce, often forces them out of their community and sometimes out of the state, depending on the industry that you're in, because of how they're worded. And they've gotten, I think, more broadly used by industries that really have no right using them. One thing when you're using a non-compete clause to protect some kind of trade secret, another thing altogether when it's like a restaurant.
Right.
Right.
Which there are people that don't believe that Jimmy John's had a non-compete clause, and that it's true. Restaurants do have, some of them have non-compete clauses. It's just totally bizarre. We had somebody in the chat ask, what is codetermination? Joey, can you explain that for folks?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to 10,000 foot view. It's a pretty large framework, but so essentially what codetermination does is it gives workers a voice in the operations of the companies. It can take a few different forms. There's shop floor codetermination, where you have workers taking a direct role in how safety standards are implemented and how certain workplace procedures are done. The broader form of codetermination involves giving labor unions or workers' councils a seat on the boards of these companies. It's pretty widely practiced in most European countries. Germany has a pretty aggressive form of codetermination, where most boards have multiple members from the trade unions sitting on them. And essentially, the goal of codetermination is not necessarily to totally wrest power from the company, but to give workers a say in what happens. And what in practice ends up happening is it creates a more a more copacetic working relationship between management and the trades unions, because the workers feel like they have a voice in hiring and firing decisions and layoffs, in expansions, that sort of thing. And on the flip side, the board gets a direct kind of line into what's going on the floor and what the workers are experiencing. And so a lot of the if you talk to a lot of manufacturers in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, they'll actually tell you that they think codetermination has been a net boost for productivity and their relationships with their trade unions, that sort of thing. We have a strange prohibition in the Taft-Hartley Act against workers' councils. It's a well-intentioned prohibition, I think, that was initially meant to stop employers from creating like pseudo unions that weren't real unions to prevent actual labor organizing. But the way it's worded in practice, it just sort of prohibits workers' councils. But we think that there's some room to work around it, at least to do some of that board level codetermination and some of the shop floor implementation sorts of things. But it I think is one of those things that could be pretty American labor movement if we could get it to catch on.
Absolutely. So you're saying that there may be some benefit to having an actual Starbucks worker seated in the boardroom instead of an empty chair there. That's
the funny thing is, in most of the rest of the world, the CEOs and board agree with that there is value in that, and that you want to have a good working relationship with your trades union. It's hard to imagine because of how hostile our relationships are with our, in the United States, but it turns out you can actually have a good working relationship.
Yeah, well, one of the big, and we saw this at the Starbucks hearing last week, one of the criticisms was like, oh, unions are too antagonistic. And, unions can be antagonistic, and I think to a certain extent they really ought to be, right? But unions are clearly, especially in the American context, they would love to not be antagonistic. And how do I know that? We can look at the last 50 years of American labor history to point to say that unions would love to not be antagonistic. But, when we're not, the owning class here in this country just takes and takes and takes and takes. So, there's reason for some amount of antagonism there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about power dynamics, right? I mean, that is the core of what this is about. Unions exist to balance power dynamics. And, I tell everybody all the time when strikes and stuff come up, nobody wants to be on strike. Workers don't want to be on strike. Management doesn't want to strike. No one wins when there's a strike. But a strike is, it's sort of like a declaration of war. It's diplomacy by other means. We've tried negotiating, we've tried working things out peacefully, and that didn't work. So now we're shutting things down until we get good faith negotiations again. And I think to outside observers, it looks like antagonism and agitating, but if you don't do it, if that those options aren't on the table, if that the ability to be antagonistic isn't there, then capital will trample over labor.
Right. Joey Andrews, representative for the 38th House District in the state of Michigan. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I've really enjoyed it.
It was a great experience. If you guys ever want to chat again, happy to do it.
Absolutely. Probably will.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.